Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can hear. It's difficult to know whether you can hear me. Let's see some nods. You can hear me. Excellent. So, as they said, my name's Arlo, Brady. I am the CEO of a company called Freuds Communications. I'm also the chairman of the Blue Marine Foundation. I wear quite a few different hats, and it's with my sustainable markets hat on that I'm sitting here today, and I have the pleasure of spending time with these three fantastic climate champions. Back, if you can cast your minds back to the lockdown 2 or 3 years ago, I can't even remember when it was because time ran slightly differently during that period. His Majesty the King, back then when he was the Prince of Wales, asked me and the Vice Chairman of EY at the time, a guy called Steve Varley, to convene a group of the world's leading chief sustainability officers. He saw an opportunity to use his convening power to drive greater collaboration between the people that were working inside companies to lead the climate transformation agenda in the world's biggest businesses. 2 or 3 years later, we've got a fantastic group of around 40 of the world's leading chief sustainability officers that come together regularly to share best practice, to explore ways of working together, to accelerate progress, and to champion the CSO role itself and its importance in business. I'm the co-chair of that group, and today, as I said, we're lucky to have three members of the group here on the panel today, ready to maybe share some of their wisdom with a larger group. We have Zach Watts, who is International Director of Sustainability at Amazon. We have Rebecca Marmot, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at Unilever. And we have Celine Herweijer, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer at HSBC. Now, we love all of our panelists equally, of course, but Celine is especially important to me because she's also on the board of Blue Marine Foundation as a trustee. So we've got three very different businesses for you here today, but they are each household brands that you will have interacted with I imagine, on a reasonably regular basis around the world. They're leaders in their respective industries, all facing into the climate crisis, but dealing with some shared challenges and some challenges that are and opportunities that are unique to their circumstance. So I think that's a pretty good place to get started and kick the conversation off. Let's try and get under the skin a little bit of the motivators and drivers that you've got inside your own organisation. So Rebecca, maybe you might want to kick things off. Unilever is pretty well known for its approach to sustainability. It's been vocal on the topic for years. I remember when I was a student 25, long time ago, Unilever was a case study, and it probably still is a case study today. What's driving the agenda at the moment on climate in Unilever, and then maybe what's driving you personally as well? What's motivating you on this agenda?
So thanks, Arlo. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear okay. So as you said, Arlo, we have a real legacy and a history in sustainability that probably formally started about 15 years ago with the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan, which I think at that stage was just a call to action and recognizing you could do business in a different way. So how could you grow the business, but at the same time mitigate damage to the environment and positively impact the value chains around the world? We moved to the second stage of that with what we called our Unilever Compass 4 years ago, where we really looked at how do we embed sustainability actions right the way across our business and across our value chain. So from the farmers in the field through to the retailers at the other end. And then just recently, we've gone into what I see as the third era now of corporate sustainability, which is really doubling down on those issues of material importance to our business if we want to achieve a net zero world. And we all, I'm sure in this room, are familiar with the IPCC guidance. We've got 6 years left at a maximum if we're going to be able to keep within that 1.5 degree trajectory. So we've taken a decision to double down our activities on climate, nature, plastics, and livelihoods. And of course, all of those are completely intertwined topics when it comes to dealing with climate. Tomorrow we have our AGM, and I think a little bit later we're going to talk about climate transition action plans. But what we've done within our CTAP is to look at if we want to get to not just a net zero target to 2039, but an interim reductions target of 40% by 2030, what steps do we need to take? So we've got much more granular around not just our long-term ambitions, but what we want to do in the short term. So what are the 10 levers that we need to activate across Unilever in order to mitigate the impact of climate change? We've looked at them with the same lens. What does that mean in terms of nature-based solutions, sustainable sourcing, the shift to regenerative agriculture? What does it mean from an ingredients perspective and formulations perspective? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And I think the other lens, and probably a newer part of the climate agenda, not for anyone in this room, but I think more publicly, is also that point around climate justice. So hence the link into livelihoods and thinking about the farmers who we're utterly dependent on for many of our raw materials and the impact of communities around the world. Certainly for us as Unilever, but also for me as an individual and for all of us, the impact of climate change now on our business is absolutely, unfortunately, critically clear. So where we source around the world has changed just in the past 4 or 5 years. We weren't able to source tomatoes, for example, last year in southern Spain, or mustard seeds in France because of droughts and because of increasing temperatures. So from a risk mitigation perspective, it's now absolutely essential. And of course, that means you're then flowing your resources and your efforts and ambitions very much into targeted areas to make a difference.
Excellent, thank you very much. And Celine, what's driving the agenda for you at HSBC? And then maybe also share a little bit about your personal motivators and your journey on this, because you haven't always been in the corporate sector.
Not always a banker. No. How's this working? Okay.
It is working, yeah.
It's, you can't even hear yourself when you're up here, so it's a challenge. So obviously HSBC, huge, large commercial bank. We released our transition plan, so I know we're coming to talk a bit about that in a few months ago. And we were quite upfront about the motivations that we have to act around the transition to net zero. And I think first of that, and it's important to make this point, is there is actually a big commercial opportunity to be at the heart of financing the transition. And it's important we're clear about that to our shareholders as well as we undergo this transformation ahead. We talk about numbers on the order of 150 trillion over the next 3 decades that will be needed to transform every industry, of which about 60% of that is in Asia and the Middle East, which are 2 key markets for us as HSBC as a bank as well. About just under 40 trillion of that will be needed by 2030. And put it another way, we also talk about the fact that about 40 to 50% of corporate capital expenditure will need to go to finance the new technologies, the new infrastructure, the new business models to succeed over the next 3 decades. In other words, if you're a large commercial bank, this has to be at the heart of your corporate strategy. And we actually did that a few years ago when we put it as one of our 4 pillars. So that was motivation number 1. Motivation number 2, this is a financially systemic risk. We all know that, right? And as a bank these days, we have to undertake stress tests as part of the exercises we do with the Bank of England, other central banks. They show orders of magnitude, but even those vastly underestimate the risk that is in the financial sector. They don't yet incorporate a whole load of things that we know exist in the real world, such as loss amplification, runaway positive climate feedback events. Things like the future of insurability will be threatened in certain low-lying coastal ecosystems where risk-based pricing means assurance will no longer be affordable, and therefore what does that mean for mortgages in 20, 30 years? So there are all sorts of these things that aren't even built into that yet. And I think there's a real recognition that climate change now should be thought of as a financially systemic risk, not just for the next, we need to think about this not just for the next 3 years, but for the next 20 to 30 in terms of the outlook on how to manage that. And for those of you that will have been reading Nature, there's some great work that was just released around nature stress testing last week as well that obviously we have to incorporate alongside that. And the final quick motivation was, we have to be at the heart of shaping how to respond, not just responding. Regulations are coming out. As a bank, our transition is the aggregate of all of our customers' transitions. That's how you calculate our so-called financed emissions. So if our customers don't get there, we don't get there. And therefore, we need to be at the forefront of engaging on the policies that are required by governments, and we can come back to that later, to make net zero possible for all of our customers across, including these two, across industries as well. Just personally, you mentioned, I mean, I'm not a banker. I started out as a climate scientist, actually, PhD climate scientist in this area, an economist as well. Then I went into industry for many years, and when I got the call to work for a bank like this, you know, those of us in these careers at the moment, this is the challenge of our generation, in a way, to solve climate. So what else would you choose when you're a graduate, really, I think?
Yeah. Presumably there's a lot of pressure from big companies to bring different types of people into large organizations like HSBC, because you need different skill sets now.
Absolutely, yeah.
Zach,
Yeah.
Amazon.
Yeah.
I don't have to describe that to anybody. Very different type, not similar to a bank, I wouldn't have thought, in many ways.
Right.
What's driving Amazon on this agenda, and what's your, share a little bit about your background and how you came to be working in this space.
Well, I'll start with the motivation from Amazon, and I think building on the theme of long-term risk, you know, we want to have a business in the future, very simply. We want to have customers that we can serve, and we want to have a planet that has customers thriving and a business that we can continue to build. And you know, long-term thinking has always been at the heart of Amazon's operating model. And you know, the science, when you look at the science, it's obviously irrefutable. We're thinking long-term. We know that we need to take action now, and leverage our scale to take action now. And I think, we're one of the companies that probably in the aftermath of the Paris Agreement, we saw a big opportunity for large businesses to catalyze the transition. And that's why we founded something in 2019 called the Climate Pledge. And that's a commitment to get to net zero by 2040. We invited other companies to join us, and over 450 have done so. And I think Unilever is one of them. So we're happy with the commitment. But I think, we're now in a phase where, to your point, Rebecca, on phases, we're now in one where it's, obviously we have to go beyond commitment. We have to be about, really focused on driving action. We've set some sort of more near-term milestones at Amazon. So we set a goal to get to 100% renewable energy by 2030. And we were pretty happy with the progress we made. We were able to bring that goal forward to 2025. And last year, we announced that we're 90% powered by renewables. So I think that's an area where Amazon was able to leverage its scale and send a real demand signal to the market around the need for clean energy. Transportation.
That makes you one of the biggest buyers of renewable energy in the world, does it not?
You stole my line, yes. Arlo, but you're right, we're the largest corporate.
That's why I'm in comms.
Thank you. We're the largest corporate purchaser of renewables. And so that's one area we've been able to make progress. Fleet electrification is another. We're midway through rolling out 100,000 EVs around the world. So we've made progress, but for sure there are many, many hard challenges that that remain. And to the point around personal motivation, my background actually is not corporate sustainability. I've been with Amazon for 12 years. I've run businesses in the US and in the UK as well. I came into sustainability about 3 years ago. And, I feel privileged to have the opportunity to drive positive change at the company. Small changes at a company like Amazon can have a really big impact. I also find just the complexity of the challenge, the problem spaces where we're operating in, the breadth of problems.
Breadth of all the different things that you're
one day it's
facing,
energy, another day it's packaging, another day it's data centers. There's a lot to get your teeth into, and that keeps me motivated.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Well, maybe let's get a little granular for a moment, not for too long. Celine, as one of the world's largest banks, HSBC is pretty well placed to help support and finance this enormous economic transformation that needs to take place quickly if we're to get to where the scientists say we need to be. So maybe you could share with us a little bit of detail on your net zero transition plan, and how you have been thinking about that as you developed it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. First of all, we thought it would take about 6 months. It took double that. It's a huge process to do, and actually the process in of itself was hugely powerful because it really matured how we were looking at the transformation that we had underway across the organization, and how we set up that program. Coming back to it, before the transition plan, we'd made a heap of announcements on things we were doing. So from setting our 2030 sector by sector portfolio targets, 1.5 degree aligns to decarbonize the portfolio, updating our, energy policy, a thermal coal phase out policy, announcing, the 1 trillion, new things we were doing around climate tech, et cetera, et cetera. So we've been doing a cluster of things, each time talking to customers, investors, regulators about these. The transition plan helps you finally bring it all together. And actually what we were missing, and what we finally got in the transition plan, was being really clear about our own strategic approach to the transition to net zero. What's distinctive about who we are and our strengths, and how we can focus those in on the transition. So we spoke about 3 things in our plan. One is transitioning industry. We've always been a bank, we are at the heart of large Asian industrial conglomerates, energy sector, the aviation sector, et cetera, the shipping sector. You've got all of these sectors, and they're going to be at the heart of the ability to make or break the transition. So our ability to partner with those, that transitioning industry pillar had to be key in terms of how we set up to work with them on their own transition plans. The second one for us was around building a new economy. So again, at HSBC's kind of start around 156 years ago or so, we were known in Hong Kong and more broadly as a bank for entrepreneurs. Now we've got climate tech, 35% of the technologies we need to solve on net zero are very early stage. So we want to be at the heart, especially with the launch of innovation banking, for helping to seed that, and we've since done various things, including a 1 billion allocation for climate tech venture debt. And the third one was around, we are a trade bank. We're one of the largest global trade banks in the world. We've got a huge supply chain financing businesses. So bringing that kind of superpower to the transition, as well as we try to help make those supply chains sustainable. But the transition plan also has a formula, right? The UK Transition Plan Task Force, GFANZ in our case, has set out the formula for what needs to be in these plans. It's the implementation plan. What does that mean? So again, we got to talk in one place around how are we changing our risk function, how are we changing our corporate governance, how are we changing accountability frameworks, how are we building capability, how are we changing portfolio and transaction decision making, what are the metrics to measure success. So actually addressing each one of these in one place. And I think the big thing is there is a bit of, as we were taking this through, there is a bit of, there was these questions, these things are clearly all dynamic. How we talk about it now when we publish the plan in January 2024, we will talk about it differently probably next year and the year after, but we can't let fear of change mean that we don't tell our story all in one place now. And so one thing that I hope we did well, and we've actually had positive feedback from the investor community and from our customers on, is we were really honest and real about where we are, the dependencies, the uncertainties, the things that are going to change, the fact that we're going to have to keep updating this all the time as well, and working with, keep following the standards and approaches as we're doing that.
And 6 months to develop it, was that a painful process? Was it difficult to push that through the organization, or did it? It
was actually 12.
Wing its way.
I think six was the early naive ambition, and it took 12. And I think it was what it needed to be, because it brought all of us together on a common understanding. And as I said, really matured our delivery model for that across the bank. And actually we now have a plan where we have the entire executive table, not just myself, but the CFO, the Chief Risk Officer, the business CEOs, all responsible for a different part of the plan. So it's really changed how we execute on this in the bank as well.
I remember one of our S30 discussions where we talked about the core capabilities that are required to be a Chief Sustainability Officer. And there was someone, I don't remember who it was now, but one of the CSOs used to be a concert conductor.
Yeah.
And we spent quite a lot of time talking about that, because actually it's one thing to get the plan through and to get the right scientific basis and understanding of the materiality and all the rest of it. It's quite another to do the persuasion of all the different parts of the organization.
Yeah.
Rebecca, as you said earlier, you are now on, was it stage three of the sustainability process. Perhaps maybe you could share a little bit more detail on what your current plan looks like at Unilever and what the big challenges and opportunities are for you in the next few years.
Thanks, Arlo. So as I mentioned, we're taking our climate transition plan to the AGM tomorrow for a vote. It's actually our second plan. So we did the first one 3 years ago. And I think at the time, we were probably one of the first major corporates to set out a climate transition action plan. And over this past 3 years, I think we've learned a lot that has helped to inform what we'll take to a vote tomorrow. So 3 years ago, we set our long-term visions, we set our targets, and of course we had a plan of how we were going to get there. What we've learned in the intervening 3 years is the granularity and the specificity is absolutely critical. So the way we approached it is we looked across, we have 5 different business groups at Unilever, and you have to remember our portfolio is very complicated. We're a foods business, we're a home care business, and we're a personal care and beauty business, all of which have different footprints and all of which have very different supply chains. So the first thing we did was really to get granular and understand where do the emissions sit across our value chain. So for example, in our home care business, we're very reliant on chemical feedstocks at the moment as part of our home care portfolio. So into your laundry detergents, for example, they're very high emission chemicals. So we're looking at how do we change that out. In our personal care business, we know that we need to change our aerosols. In our foods business, we know that we need a big shift to regenerative agriculture rather than relying on the current agricultural methods that we've used for many years. So that was stage one. The second stage was to then take that transition plan and to take our thoughts and our processes and our calculations to the SBTI, to the Science Based Target Initiative, and to get them aligned with their 1.5 degree trajectory, because that was crucially important for us in order to be taken seriously, that the rigor and the structure behind that was based on climate science. So we did that. Then the third stage, and I think this is the flip and probably the most exciting part of the journey, and Arlo, I think the opportunity, is then if you put an innovation lens onto R&D and you put that sustainability lens on, instead of, and I think this is a common mistake, and I'm sure many of you in the room have felt this, that somehow sustainability is stopping something, it's taking something away. When you put an innovation lens on that, it's actually hugely exciting. So if I take the example that I just mentioned around the home care portfolio, actually now we're exploring big biotech partnerships. How can we have non-chemical feedstocks in the laundry portfolio? And that leads you to actually having better products. We launched last week a 15-minute laundry detergent. So particularly for people living in urban areas and want to do a quick wash, you only need to put the washing machine on for 15 minutes. And the formulations are much more climate and environmentally friendly. And I think that innovation lens is hugely important. The second big learning that we had is we can't do this on our own. And I think a lot of the work that we'd done, we'd spent a long time mapping out very detailed roadmaps, but actually the opportunity to work pre-competitively in groups like Arlo mentioned, like the S30, on systems change is hugely important. So we went out to Ottawa to the INC4 a couple of weekends ago, which is where the negotiations are taking place for the UN Plastics Treaty. And together with a couple of other consumer goods companies, we've been really actively pushing for mandatory guidelines and policies around plastics, because you've got to level the playing field. So innovation plays one role, but also the role of government in standardizing policy and advocacy is really, really important. And a lot of the work that we're doing relies very much on advocacy. So each of the 10 points that we have set out in our climate transition action plan is based on R&D and innovation and business group change, but also backed up by advocacy and policy. And then I say the last thing, and this has really made a difference, is we've truly integrated this into our strategic planning process. So we have cost-bound, time-bound roadmaps, and to Celine's point, that are owned by our business groups day to day. And I think that is hugely important, because it's taken our original plan, which was sort of there in the ether and part of Unilever, and now translated it into the strategic planning cycle at Unilever. And I think that's made a huge amount of difference.
Given how long you've been working on this topic, do you have other companies coming to see you and sort of asking to go on a tour and learn about the process you've been through, given that you're probably further ahead than a lot of other organisations?
So we do, and I mean, Celine mentioned as well, groups like the Transition Plan Task Force that we fed into, together with many other companies that I think have provided a framework. But I think for us particularly, where it's been most beneficial is as part of the calculations and part of the work that we did to understand where our emissions lie, we know that the 300 of our biggest suppliers that have the largest footprint are actually a massive contribution to our scope 3. And so we're now sitting down with them, and if you think about our footprint in our business, really big, for example, agricultural companies, to look at, and as I think many of you know, in climate plans you have an SBTI, you have your flag, you have your forest, land, agricultural scope, and then you have your industrial emissions. Particularly sitting down with our partners in both of those areas and saying, okay, how do we work together to decarbonize your value chain? What are the steps that you need to take? How do we, for example, work with Pepsi on regenerative agriculture? So we're sourcing soy for Hellmann's mayonnaise, they're sourcing corn, I think, for Doritos. How can we work with farmers to intercrop to help improve the productivity, but at the same time protect the earth, make sure that the farmers are able to nourish the environment and nourish the soils, make sure that the soil health is improving? So lots of examples that I think where if you sit down with your partners, of course, whom we're utterly reliant on, you reach where you need to get quicker. And then at the other end of our value chain, many of our retail partners, so some of the world's biggest retailers, have asked us to work together with them on their net zero plans because, of course, we are their scope 3. So I think right the way along the value chain, you are completely dependent upon one another. And I think actually that's why so much of this does need to be done pre-competitively. And it's why I also mentioned that point about advocacy and policy, because there are certain things that we need to do collectively as the business world. So I just was in a lunch prior to this talking about the road to COP29 and what do we want to see as a business community in terms of countries and NDCs. And I think sometimes governments are surprised when they hear the private sector asking for more regulation in this space and greater transparency around policy.
And how easy was it to get through the third stage of this process for you? Like with Celine, is it a big challenge, or is the organisation very receptive to this agenda given how long you've been playing there?
These are, to Celine's point, very time-intensive, labour-intensive processes, and I think that the level of degree and rigour now that we all need to have in our transition plans, if you're taking it to a shareholder vote, means that you need to put that level of work in. But I think generally, there is an excitement about this. I think all of our companies, everyone sitting here in this room, is working on this agenda. A, because you want to make a difference, and B, because we can make a difference if we orient our businesses in different ways. And I think from a Unilever perspective, the innovation opportunity is really exciting. And when I sit down with our colleagues in research and development, this is a huge opportunity for them to reduce the carbon footprint of our products and make products and bring to life opportunities for our consumers so that they end up with higher quality products, but also at the same time ones that we know are beneficial and helpful to the environment. And then I think just the last point as well, which has been a massive motivator, is that what I mentioned at the beginning around this link into climate justice and thinking about how we work with the people across our value chain. So our small-scale retailers who operate, for example, in developing and emerging markets that have been massively impacted by climate change, or farmers that have been massively impacted by climate change. I think that has been a hugely motivating and powerful force in being able to galvanise internal energy.
Yeah. Zach, I can't even begin to imagine what your supply chain looks like and the level of complexity that is involved with that. You've already talked to us a little bit about the operational side of your transition plan. Maybe you can share with us a little bit of detail on the work that you're doing with the Climate Pledge and collaborating with suppliers and your consumers to help take them on that journey.
Sure. I find myself nodding along a lot to what Rebecca was saying there, because the basic building blocks of building a plan are very familiar to us. We started with the data and the science and really understanding where the emissions are coming from and building out our own carbon accounting models. And so I think our primary focus has been on operational transformation, the things I talked about before, energy, transportation, increasingly looking at the hard-to-abate sectors. We're exposed to some pretty heavy industrial sectors like aviation, maritime, construction, so the innovation layer in those segments has been increasingly important for us. We look at that through the lens of investment. We have a $2 billion Climate Pledge Fund that we're using to plant seed capital in early stage pioneering companies. We think about it through the lens of collaboration as well with suppliers and other value chain partners, because there's no way Amazon, big though we are, can go it alone. And so I think to your point around sort of suppliers and consumers, on the sort of supplier side, similar exercise. We've looked at the data, and it's a couple of hundred suppliers are the ones that make the difference. So we're gearing up now to think about how can we work with those suppliers, how can we demonstrate preferential treatment to suppliers that have kind of robust targets in place that are aligned with our own.
Yeah.
The Climate Pledge has proven a really valuable engine for us to work with other companies. A couple of examples, maritime again. So we've worked with Maersk, who are a Climate Pledge signatory, and others to build a buying alliance for early access to low carbon shipping routes, biofuels. We're now shipping some of our containers with methanol, so we're seeing some early progress there, and that wouldn't happen if it was just, you can't do that just from within the four walls of Amazon. Also through the Climate Pledge, we've been able to leverage some of the kind of private sector partnerships, so we're very excited about a partnership we have with C40, which is the alliance of mayors. Yeah, so 40 mayors from cities around the world who are taking urgent climate action, and we're working on a program there to accelerate investment in heavy-duty trucking in Latin America and in India. And then the customer piece is interesting as well. So when we look at the data, we know that customers care about sustainability, and especially so here in the UK and in France and in Germany and in Europe, which is a region that I'm particularly close to. They also still care a lot about price and convenience and speed of delivery. So, that's just the sort of fact of life. But I think we're seeing sustainability.
But as I was discovering the other day when I was talking to someone from Amazon, actually speed of delivery and climate impact are not necessarily in conflict with one another.
That's right. Actually, speed often helps because we can locate inventory closer to customers.
Closer to the customer.
And have shorter last mile routes. But when you look at the customer lens, actually we've been working on sustainable packaging. So packaging is a great example because it's the thing, whenever I tell anyone that I work in sustainability for Amazon, the first question I get is, what are you doing about the boxes?
Yeah.
And
what are you doing about the boxes?
Well, we've been working on the boxes for longer than we've had a climate plan. We've actually been working on the boxes for longer than I've worked at Amazon. So like 15 years ago, we started, packaging engineering, really focused on how do we reduce packaging? Because there's an obvious kind of benefit for cost as well as decarbonisation there. And we've been able to reduce packaging weight per shipment by over 40% since 2015, taken out 2 million tons of packaging waste. Then we shifted to materials, and we've switched in Europe from, we used to use plastics, and now we use only 100% recyclable packaging. And increasingly, you'll find products shipped to you from Amazon without any overboxing. So 11% of units globally last year was shipped just as the manufacturer packages them, so that's kind of the ultimate net zero carbon solution from a secondary packaging perspective. So, packaging, it's important for our carbon plan. It's not the biggest thing, it's not as big as transportation, but it's an illustration of where we've followed the customer demand, and there are other examples as well.
Yeah, great. Well, consumers and the supply chain's one part of the equation, I suppose. The other part is government and regulators, and I think you touched on that a little bit, Rebecca, in what you were saying there. HSBC, Unilever, Amazon, these are all companies that you could argue are at the forefront of some of the efforts in the sustainability space. But for every one Unilever, there's probably hundreds of companies that are not necessarily making so much progress. So, and in that context, if you're trying to persuade your internal audiences to take action on this agenda, I would imagine you would be looking to governments and regulators to level the playing field a little bit. Celine, maybe you could share a few perspectives on that. What's on your wish list from government? Then we've missed them, I think, because they've already left the room. But what's your wish list for government?
Yeah, I mean, stating the obvious, business as usual is not an option. We are entering a 1.5 degree world any moment. We're definitely going to be there for a generation, for 30 years or so. And even with the stated policies right now, we're heading to a 2.4 degree world. We have to bring that down to 1.9, 1.8, whatever. So we need quickly a change in how we're approaching this. And I mentioned as HSBC, we're really interesting as well because we kind of have customers across every sector. Every sector we've set this target for a 1.5 degree aligned portfolio. And then our transition plan, we talk about what the policies and the technologies are needed in each of those sectors to be able to get there, right?
Yes.
And therefore, clearly, we want to be engaging with our customers across these sectors and governments to try and help enable that to happen. But I think the point that Rebecca made on level playing field is critical, right? Because we're going to be asking companies, investors to put their capital into places that aren't necessarily always competitive at the moment. Renewables is a much better space right now, apart from areas where there's a higher cost of capital, but you go to many of the other things like sustainable aviation fuels, big premium, right? The list goes on when you try and do those. So as soon as you have policies that create more of a level playing field, like the SAF mandate, 10% by date 2030, things like that, they're absolutely critical. I think we talk a lot about the US Inflation Reduction Act, but that's what the world needs. The world needs clean industrial policy on steroids that starts to offer a variety of different tax credits, incentives, frameworks to supercharge investment. And there's an incredible statistic in the last year or so, for every dollar that went into the IRA in terms of funding those tax credits, it's achieved a $5.5 of private investment in the same, so 1 to 5.5, and that's the same thing. That's the way we need to design policy to get, to unlock this 150 trillion or so that we spoke in. So I think clean industrial policy on steroids, we need everyone to do transition plans, right? Disclosure is critical, having the data, but also the action plans. And as I think I mentioned, when you actually do the action plans, it's not just your target, your data, but it's the process itself that supercharges transformation in all of our organizations and accountability back to our constituents. And then I think, as a financial organization, we have our own regulators as well as the policy. And on our side, some of the things that we need to think about is, it would be helpful in the sector to have clear guidelines on incorporating transition risk into credit risk methodologies. Like that's an obvious one. In high risk sectors, the cost of capital at the moment is very high if you want to invest in renewables on your balance sheet, right? That's there for a reason. They have long tenors, but actually how do we start to look at that in a way so that banks can finance more of that stuff at scale and obviously distribute it to investors? So there's a whole load of stuff there for us to look at. But absolutely, we're not going to get there with business as usual, and we need the right construct across sectors for us to be leaning in with our own capital to finance the
as that guy's T-shirt said, there's a guy here with a T-shirt on, take action or die frying. Yeah, exactly. There's a message for you. The little indicator is telling us we're going to run out of time very quickly. So I thought it might be, the CSO, we've spoken to quite a few recruitment consultants recently with the S30, and the Chief Sustainability Officer role is very desirable. I would imagine there's quite a few people in this room potentially that aspire to having a role of that type. So I thought maybe we might close things by just asking for a brief one-liner from each of you about what is the one piece of advice you wish someone had given to you before you took on this role that would have been really useful to you. Do you want to start, Celine?
I'll start really quickly. We've all spoken about collaboration, but I'll choose the word materiality because there's so much for us to do. It's such a big challenge, there's not much time, but actually really thinking where are the areas that you can make the most material impact, right, in terms of minimizing risk, bending down emissions and driving commercial performance out of sustainability, and then moving on to the next one, but really focusing on materiality to make a difference with the time that you have as in the organization.
Excellent.
In this area.
Thank you. Zach?
I think for me it's, coming into a role like this, it's just be prepared to really dial up the intellectual curiosity. I found the role to be way more multidisciplinary than I was expecting. You need business, operations, finance, policy, comms. It really cuts across the business. And I knew that coming into it, but it's been more sort of exaggerated, I think, than...
Multitasking.
Yeah.
Rebecca?
I'd say be an optimist and try and galvanise change. It's very easy in business to carry on doing what you've done if it's kind of going okay. And actually, you have to be a disruptor. You need to change formulations. You need to be brave and speak out. You need to maybe move away from what's always worked before and do something totally different. And I think you, as a CSO, you've got to be the person often that is the instigator of that change.
Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. That's wonderful. So be optimistic, be brave, only do the things that are material, the things that really matter, and learn to multitask and have some curiosity to do lots of different things, because it's a complex subject. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that. That's all we've got time for. Thank you.